Not Geneva Oberholzer. I tried my best, but I just don't have her style or other attributes. My name is Felix Gutierrez. I'm on the faculty of the School of Journalism and also the School of Communication, where among the classes I teach are race and the media, and also, of course, on Latino media in the U.S. And I'm unusual among faculty in that I teach at USC, but I live in Northern California, in the city by the bay, Oakland. And people ask me, Felix, why do you live in Oakland and work in LA? Well, one of the reasons that I really like living in Northern California and being a migrant worker and commuting back and forth is that for many years, as a subscriber to the San Francisco Chronicle, I was able to read and fortunate to read the very good reporting of our speaker today, Tyche Hendricks, who reported on immigration, demographic changes, social changes in the country, and basically has a real knack for taking what are largely number stories, poll surveys and things like that, and trading them into human stories that had a real interest. In fact, including all the hate mail that journalists get at the time, I remember at least one occasion I emailed Tyche and said, you did a really solid job in today's paper. I really liked it. So she has taken complex subjects and made them understandable and interesting to people who might not pay attention to them other ways. She also, in this age of media convergence and multimedia, is a true multimedia journalist. She left the Chronicle within the last year and a half, a year ago, and is now with KQED, Public Broadcasting in the Bay Area. So she's a broadcaster as well. She has written a book, The Wind Doesn't Need a Passport, which she'll talk more about today in our session. So she's working in the book form as well. And she loves students and teaching. She's on the faculty of the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California at Berkeley, which is your parents' institution, if I'm not mistaken. So children of graduates of Berkeley become USC faculty. In Gabe Kaplan's case, that's it. She's going to talk to us about her book and also some about her career in reporting. And I've asked her to put a little twist on some things you're dealing with, Gabe, on entrepreneurship. Because at the end of this, you're working for a newspaper, but then you want to do a book, you want to go into broadcasting, teaching, basically how do journalists think about different ways they can take their talents and their skills in different directions as their careers evolve. So I'd like to give a Trojan welcome. Welcome to USC to Tyche Hendricks. Welcome to
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to come up here so that I can spread out a little bit. But I don't need the mouse. It is a pleasure to be here. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Yep. So, thank you for that great introduction, Dave. It's changing times in journalism. I feel very fortunate that I have made this transition from a newspaper career into writing books and editing in public radio. I want to talk about the book and about my view of the border that the book embodies. And then I do want to make sure we have some time to talk a little bit about reporting itself and answer questions that you might have. So I think to start with, maybe I'll tell you about the cover. It's called The Wind Doesn't Need a Passport. Some people have taken that as sort of, oh, open borders statement, but in fact, this was something that was said to me by an air pollution expert from the university in Mexicali in Baja California. And he was basically making the point that if we put a power plant on one side and it's producing emissions, we're going to breathe them on the other side, and vice versa, that we're very linked at the border, that air and water flow back and forth. And I think the photo also was an attempt to show that. I think a lot of times when we see a photograph of the border, we're looking at a picture of the border fence. And I was up in a little propeller plane with a rancher down in southern New Mexico, what they call the blue gila, with the New Mexico that sticks down there. And he was showing me his land and how the border fence is actually his pasture fence in a lot of places. And this is the international boundary right here. And what I liked about the picture was that you can see that from New Mexico into Chihuahua, it's really the same place. And I think that's an aspect of the border that we don't talk about enough. So in the public conversation and the political conversation, it's very common to speak of the border as a dividing line, or a line that maybe doesn't sufficiently divide us as it should. It's maybe a little too porous. You hear politicians from across the political spectrum saying we need to secure the border when we're talking about immigration. And in fact, my first stories that I did on the border were stories that I reported in southeastern Arizona and northern Sonora and places like Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta and Sasabe, Sonora. And looking at migrants trying to come across into this country, the kinds of hurdles that they were running into with a sort of a nascent vigilante movement that was emerging at that time that sort of prefigured the Minutemen, at the death toll as migrants were kind of coming across the really punishing desert in Arizona and hundreds of them dying every year there, and how the local communities and local authorities are dealing with that. And I really did see these sort of two parallel worlds on either side of this international boundary. And I think if I had stopped there, that would have been my sense of the border. But I was fortunate to go back to my newsroom and I got the stories in the paper, and at one point I was talking with my editor, and he said, there's got to be more to the border than illegal immigrants and Minutemen, and what is it? And so that kind of gave me license to go back and to do more reporting trips and to explore different issues at the border, whether it's environmental issues or trade, manufacturing, culture and history, and a range of other things. And the more time that I spent there, the more I discovered that for people who live in the borderlands, it's really a binational region. And there's like 1 million crossings of that border every day. It's the longest border between a developed and a developing country anywhere in the world. And that gives it this amazing dynamism. There's a lot going on there. And there are many, many people, and certainly not all of them, but there are many people who have binational lives, who live, in San Diego and work in Tijuana, or who live in Reynosa, or say Ciudad Juarez, and go to school in El Paso every day and cross that border every day. And people, shop back and forth, or they go to the dentist, or they go fill a prescription. And I started to see it as more like a cell wall, like this permeable membrane that does regulate things that go back and forth, but that things flow there. And there's a journalist friend of mine, Ricardo Sandoval, who's done a lot of reporting at the border in New Mexico, and he calls it a seam that stitches the two countries together. Actually, there was a geographer who used to be at USC, Michael Deere, who's now up at Berkeley, and he talks about it as a third nation. It's not quite one place or the other. And so I saw that in a lot of different ways, where the fire departments in Calexico, California, and Mexicali in Baja California have mutual aid agreements. So, if there's a fire, the fire trucks come. It doesn't matter which side of the border you're on. I saw it with this rancher, William Hurt, and his family, Anglo family that had homesteaded in southern Arizona 100 years ago. A lot of their ranch hands, their cowboys, vaqueros, came from Chihuahua. He actually fell in love with a cousin of one of those ranch hands, and they courted back and forth, but it was time to get married. They were very concerned about following immigration law to the letter, and they actually got married at the Little Antelope Wells port of entry. And she stood on one side, and he stood on the other, and they said their I do's, and she stepped across into the United States. So their families are now knitted together at the border. I saw it in stories that I reported on the high rates of HIV infection in San Diego and Tijuana, much higher than in other comparable cities in either country. And it became clear in the reporting of that story that very much as people have binational lives, lives on both sides of the border, there are people who have sexual lives on both sides of the border, and the virus was moving back and forth. But at the same time, there were healthcare workers and epidemiologists who were also moving back and forth and talking to each other and collaborating and doing prevention work and tracing down how do we intervene in this epidemic. And I saw it in a very vivid way at a little place that I will read you a little bit about on the border between Texas and Tamaulipas. This is the way the book opens. The green-brown water of the Rio Grande swirls and eddies as it flows eastward past the overhanging trees on the shore at Los Ebanos, Texas, site of the last hand-pulled ferry crossing on the U.S.-Mexico border. The steel barge, tethered to a system of cables and pulleys, plies the river from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. each day. The ferry's deck can accommodate 3 cars, a dozen pedestrians, and a few stocky men in feed store caps and dusty blue jeans, who grasp a rope spanning the river and pull rhythmically, leaning their bodies into the work. On the 39th pull, the ferry floats across the midline of the river, leaving the United States and entering Mexico. Elsewhere along its length, the international line is marked by a steel wall flooded with stadium lights or a few strands of barbed wire tacked to wooden fence posts. At the San Isidro port of entry, a painted yellow stripe across 24 lanes of traffic indicates the place where one country ends and the other begins. At Reynosa, a plaque in the center of a bridge over the Rio Grande marks the dividing line. Here at Los Ebanos, the river's midpoint exists somewhere on the muddy bottom, but no sign points it out. It must be imagined. Here on the ferry, on the river's surface, people, cars, bicycles, groceries, and small loads of goods travel back and forth. There are some tourists drawn by the quaintness of this international gateway between 2 country villages, but most passengers here are local. They live in Los Ebanos, named for the grand ebony trees growing there, or the Mexican town of Diaz Ordaz, a couple of miles down the road. They take the ferry, 50 cents for pedestrians, $2.50 for vehicles, to work, to the supermarket, or to visit relatives. They know each other, and the ferrymen, and the customs inspectors on each bank. For them, the border is not so much a boundary line as it is a meeting point, a place where different parts of their lives converge. It's not as if there is no borderline. Homeland Security inspections are a fact of life, even at the rustic ferry crossing at Los Ebanos. And binational tensions play out frequently, whether over pollution, truck traffic, or the causes and consequences of drug-related violence. But equally real are the relationships that link the 2 sides, as the little hand-pulled barge does each day. The border's influence, like the muddy water, laps at both countries. So, as I went about my reporting, I wasn't looking for that theme, but that is sort of something that came out and revealed itself to me in the course of the work and the reporting and the writing process. And I think, just to say parenthetically, something that's quite different from writing what started out as a series of newspaper stories that just stood on their own and part of a series, and turning it into a book, is that a book is asking for more of a perspective, more of a point of view, more of a theme. And that is the sort of the storyline that came out for me, is that we miss this aspect of the border, this connectedness at the border. And so that's what I chose to talk about. We see it play out with something like the Arizona law, SB 1070, that was passed over the summer that empowers state and local police authorities to enforce federal immigration law, which is a contested idea, because traditional immigration law is very complex law and something that the federal government is empowered to do. And it's something that's being challenged in court by the U.S. government. And there are a whole range of factors that I think went into the politics that led to that law passing, but it's also had a very real impact. Arizona was supposed to be the host for the annual Border Governors Conference this past year. The 6 governors of the border states of Mexico and the 4 governors of the U.S. border states meet every year to talk about issues and just maintain a relationship. And the Mexican governors decided that they really didn't feel welcome in Arizona with issues about racial profiling of people who were foreign or maybe didn't belong there. And it's a shame because really that's the kind of dialogue. I mean, there should be more of that dialogue on the border, I think, now than ever. And this is cutting into that. So that's a real consequence of friction at the border, but I also saw ways that even in a place like Arizona, there's still a lot of collaboration at the border, and I saw that in relation to healthcare and hospitals. A lot of doctors in southern Arizona have long-standing relationships with doctors and hospitals in northern Sonora, and they found, that there were times when there would be critical cases that were coming north from Mexico because, as well trained as the doctors were, they didn't have the state-of-the-art equipment to take care of really difficult cases. And so they were sending them to U.S. hospitals, and at some cost to those hospitals, in many cases not reimbursed. But because there were collaborative relationships and a dialogue going on there, they could say, well, what do you need? How can we help? And they found that some of these American hospitals had some surplus equipment, CAT scan machines and other kinds of equipment that they could donate and share with their counterparts in places like Nogales, Sonora, and Hermosillo, Agua Prieta, and so forth. And they did that and really cut down on the numbers of cases and the cost of cases that were coming north. So that's another reality.
Sure. I don't think this is this goes to your
sorry.
Mess, so,
So I'm going to read you in a minute a little bit about that hospital collaboration. Because
Let's hear it for Gabe.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Taki. You went to the right guy. He knows his way around the technology.
So I spent some time in a little hospital, the general hospital in Nogales, Sonora. Enrique Contreras was the deputy medical director there. He said, well, let me back up a little bit. U.S. and Mexican healthcare providers at the border, meanwhile, have become adept at cutting through red tape, making direct personal connections and working out solutions while waiting for federal help, without waiting for federal help. Rich Polheber, who was the director of the little Catholic hospital in Nogales, Arizona, had hosted evening social gatherings to help the doctors of ambos Nogales get acquainted. And Holy Cross may even be able to use its border location to improve its bottom line. That was his hospital. We're trying to get an orthopedic surgeon and other specialists, Polheber said. If we build a new modern facility, there are people who can pay, who will come over the border to us. In Nogales, Sonora, Enrique Contreras was already seeing the benefits of the cross-border collaboration. In the primary care clinic of the Hospital General, he weaved his way between knots of waiting patients and through swinging doors into the new wing. He showed off the trauma room and 2 surgical theaters outfitted with equipment donated by the American hospitals. Not even the private hospitals have this, he said. Contreras beamed most broadly as he entered his hospital's new intensive care unit for newborns, where a mother nursed her 12-day-old preemie, and a father sat attentively beside a day-old infant on a child-sized ventilator. Before we built this, we had to send premature babies to Hermosillo or Tucson, and U.S. hospitals never sent the babies back to us, at least as long as they were in the hospital's care. Of course, they went back afterwards. Now they can, and we're very pleased and proud to be able to receive them. So those collaborative relationships are a real part of the border story that I think is not told very much. But it's also true that people who live in the borderlands are bearing the brunt, in many cases, of policies that are made far away in Washington, D.C. or Mexico City, and policies that aren't necessarily working as well as they should be, whether regarding immigration or drug trafficking and so forth. And you can see that, for example, on the Hurt Ranch, where every time a smuggler would drive a load of dope across, or a group of migrants, and cut the fences, the cattle would get out. And then there's this whole cost and expense and trouble for the family of rounding the cattle back up again and so forth. This was very poignant on the Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation. And these are people who, for thousands of years, have lived in southern Arizona, northern Sonora, and have had a long history of going back and forth across the border. But they are really at ground zero now as border enforcement was built up in the San Diego area and the El Paso area. And this is now where a lot of unauthorized migration goes, a lot of particularly marijuana smuggling happens. And in a very remote area, a very poor tribe without a lot of job opportunities, when somebody says, drive this car to Tucson and I'll give you $2,000, it's very tempting, and it has this very corrosive impact on people there. So I spent some time there, and there was a police sergeant who said, my brother was caught doing that, and he spent a year in federal prison, and now he's on parole. But this is, it's sort of eroding the fabric of life there, and this is not something that, these are people who predate the border, predate the United States and Mexico as countries. And you see it in border cities very much with the very grim and gruesome toll of the drug violence playing out in Mexico, in places, especially someplace like Ciudad Juarez today. My book, each chapter is set in a different place on the border, deals with a different issue, has a different sort of cast of characters. So I did a chapter that dealt with the drug trade, and that was set in Tijuana. And one way that I found to illustrate that toll was through a child care center. And let me read you just a little bit about that. On a Tijuana side street, just steps from the rusting steel border fence, 24 preschoolers ate a lunch of spaghetti and milk one December day at the Mother Antonia Child Care Center for the families of police officers. After their teachers cleared the little tables and wiped the small hands clean, the children erupted in squeals of excitement. The Christmas posada was about to begin. A clown twisted long balloons into the shapes of butterflies and dachshunds. His wife painted tiger stripes and whiskers on the children's faces. And a teacher passed a basket of colorful cascarones, blown eggs filled with confetti. Soon the kids were chasing each other around the playroom, smashing the eggshells on each other's heads, and raining bits of pastel paper over everything. The nursery school, named for an aging nun who sat in the midst of the cheerful chaos, formed a cocoon of safety around these children. On the streets outside, 33 of their parents' colleagues had been murdered over the course of that year, gunned down in a vicious war over drug smuggling turf. We haven't lost any parents, but sometimes there's this sadness because their co-workers have been killed, said Palmira Flores, the center's director. I tell them, don't fight with your husband in the morning because you don't know if he's coming home at night. So those tolls, and that's very much a toll. It's easy for us to say, poor benighted Mexico with these drug cartels and control and fighting it out over there. But of course, the drug trafficking exists there because the demand for drugs is strong in this country, and it's like $60 billion or whatever that Americans pay for their drugs every year, and that money, a lot of it goes back to Mexico, and a lot of it buys the weapons that arm the cartels and so forth. So it's very much a binational problem. But But it's also true that the problems at the border are probably not, in most cases, problems that can be solved at the border, in part because they're not of the making of the border, of the border's making. And so part of the intention of this book is to get those stories out to people who live far away from the border, whether they're policymakers or just other folks you know, who care about public policy and politics. To think about how can we develop our relationship with Mexico in a way that serves both of our countries, and that it's not seeing things as so much of an either or, an us or them, but as Mexico's ambassador Arturo Sarucán said to me in an interview, we need to learn how to play chess. Right now we're playing marbles, and we need to think strategically a few more steps ahead and see, you know, that what we do in the interest of the other country might actually be in our own interest as well. And so we're starting to see some encouraging signs in that direction. Something like the Merida Initiative, which is this counter-narcotics effort that the U.S. is funding with Mexico, has shifted from buying helicopters and big sort of military equipment to more work on training for police forces on evidence gathering and handling investigations, helping support Mexico's effort to transform its judicial process to a process of what they call oral trials, more like what we have, and increasing transparency. And I think that there are more ways that the United States can help Mexico building its infrastructure, building its economy, and so forth, that will, in the long run, have a beneficial effect on our country, because, as I say, Mexico's not going anywhere, we're not going anywhere, we're neighbors here, and so that's the perspective that I'm trying to impart here. And I would be happy to talk a little bit about the reporting process. As I say, it started with stories I wrote for the newspaper. I was actually approached by an editor at the University of California Press who asked me to expand it into a book, and I thought, sure, no problem, it's written already. I'll just whip it off. But of course, it wasn't quite that simple. You know, sort of a 3 or 4 year process of doing more reporting, a lot of background research, because it's a university press book. There's a whole layer of peer review and vetting and footnoting and so forth as well. And that the kind of writing for a book, as I say, is a different one than writing for a newspaper, and learning to sustain a storyline over a longer stretch. But I would be happy to you know, take some questions and talk a little bit about not only the content of the book, but how the book came together. So let me open it up to you for some questions. Yeah.
Just say who you are. Introduce yourself.
My name is Albert Saladeh. I'm a second-year broadcast journalism master's student. And at the end of your talk, you talked about how helping, or Mexico will help ourselves. Could you talk more about that, or tell us more specifically what that would look like?
Well, I should say this is, you know, I'm a journalist, first and foremost. This is not sort of a policy prescription kind of a book. But in my conclusion, I do point to some scholars and thinkers who have some thoughts about ways that the two countries could work together a little more. Using, for example, as I mentioned, the structure of the Merida Initiative, to help strengthen transparency and the rule of law in Mexico. There are ways that, whatever you think of NAFTA, there is now this you know, 3-country sort of structure for North America. And there's a couple, Robert Pastor at American University is one, and Jeff Foe at the Economic Policy Institute is somebody else who talked about how we can use that structure of NAFTA to, whether with loan guarantees or other ideas, to help strengthen Mexico's economy, infrastructure, building a tax base that can support you know, infrastructure, social services, so that Mexico can produce the jobs that will give a meaningful sort of life and future for its people at home, rather than people feeling that they have to migrate. You know, there are probably more things we could do with recognizing that migration is here to stay, with 100 years of Mexican presence, you know, in this country, going all the way to more than 100 years, but going all the way to someplace like Chicago. That there are deep roots that connect people and families in the two countries, and that whatever immigration policy we refine needs to take that into account as well. So, but it's more, I'm pointing in the conclusion towards other people's ideas and how they're going.
Other questions from students?
Yes, sir.
There's a lot of talk about tightening security at the border, be it building a physical fence or an electronic fence or even militarization of the border. What do you think the effects will be of that kind of project in terms of like cross-border economic activity and also other aspects?
Well, I think we're seeing the effects, because I think the latest data that I looked at, the money that the United States spends on border enforcement now is like 5 times what we were spending a decade ago, and even that was, you know, orders of magnitude higher than what we spent a decade before that. So that ramping up of border enforcement, whether in terms of physical infrastructure, fence building, technology, but also border control and customs and border protection, has been steadily increasing. I wrote a story for the Chronicle, I guess it was probably in 2006, when the Sensenbrenner bill proposed adding 700 miles of fence along the 2,000-mile border, and I talked to people who said, if that thing were to pass, you know, that we would have probably, the more and harder it gets to cross, people aren't necessarily going to stop crossing, but you're more likely to see more tunneling, more people coming around by sea, more people, you know, sort of using false papers through ports of entry and that kind of thing. And I think we are seeing that, and those 700 miles of fence were built. And, you know, but as I say, it's a 2,000-mile boundary. You know, there are questions as to how much can you in fact actually seal it. You have impacts, for example, in the Ambos Nogales, the 2 Nogales is there between Arizona and Sonora. They used to have a civic parade that went, you know, through both towns, and it was very much for for those cross-border communities. There is a very much of a sense of we are linked in culture, in our sort of economic well-being, and so forth. That kind of thing gets harder now, and with wait times and so forth, just sort of back and forth migration and movement of goods and trade gets harder. And there is some thinking going on the part of the federal governments about how can we do more to ensure that cargoes are secure before they get to the border, what they call sort of 21st century borders, so that you can speed the flow of goods across the border. But there are trade-offs, and you know, we're not in that world of joint civic parades anymore. But I think, you know, again, the idea that you can sort of solve border problems, whether it's the smuggling of people or drugs or whatever it might be, at the border, I think is just a limited slice of the picture. You've got to take a more holistic approach.
Turn to the faculty now.
Burkhard Timberlake, I'm faculty member in the Public Relations Program. Question, did you ever feel personally like unsafe given in particular the drug violence down there? Were there any concerns about, you know, you being investigated before or anything that made you feel threatened?
You know, I mean, I think this is something that the journalists need to be attentive to going into any kind of a new and unfamiliar reporting situation, and one where there is a level of violence. As I say, each chapter deals with a different issue. My drug chapter in Tijuana, you know, I was looking for sort of different ways to tell the story, not just the big guns and the dead bodies. So spending time, you know, in the preschool for police officers' kids, talking to people in drug rehab, because part of the story there is how drugs get bottled up in Tijuana, and there's a higher rate of addiction there. I did do a ride along with a sort of a joint federal local anti-narcotics squad, and you know, and yeah, there are risks, but I think when you're reporting, it's important for especially young reporters, but for any of us, to think about, as you're going into a situation, keeping your eyes open, sort of keeping your wits about you, your sense of that sort of like when the hair stands up and you don't feel right kind of sensibility, trusting that intuition, but knowing how you're going to get back out of the situation. You know, developing a lot of contacts on the ground beforehand, so that you have people that you can turn to, and so I didn't really feel like I was in physical danger, but I think that's something that, you know, that reporters need to be attentive to and make smart decisions about.
Brother? I've got a question,
Yeah.
if I'm permitted. How is reporting for a book different than reporting for a news story, newspaper? And secondly, can you talk a little bit more about the entrepreneur? Because here you've been a newspaper reporter, had a solid beat, great work, but you've really expanded into other venues in the last year or so. I'd like to hear a little bit more. Most of our students will be, you know, multimedia. They'll probably have more than one career. It's very unlikely that they'll go to work for one organization and retire, you know, 45 years later. So the kinds of skills you've done as you've kind of retooled yourself might be helpful, or the scariness or the questions you may have.
So to the first question, I started out reporting these stories for the newspaper, and as you would going into any reporting situation in a place where you don't live, there's a lot of sort of background research of kind of getting the lay of the land and finding sources who can give you some background and can point you towards people, you know, who's the next person that you should talk to. And in many cases, when you're doing it from a distance over the phone, the people that you hook up with first are people in sort of official institutions, whether it's universities or businesses or nonprofits or the government. But then they can lead you to other people who can, once you get there, can, you know, sort of help you meet people in communities on the ground that you might not encounter otherwise. So I found the rancher family by calling the, you know, New Mexico State University in Las Cruces and talking to somebody in the agriculture department who said, oh, you should really talk to this large animal veterinarian out in Silver City. He deals with a lot of the ranchers down in that area on the border. He knows a lot of them. He goes out and you know, checks their cattle and horses and so forth. And so talked to him, and he put me in touch with the Hurt family, talked to them, and they said, yes, come on down. And actually he met the vet when he was down there too on the Hurt Ranch, and he put me to work pregnancy testing cattle, which is a dirty job. You know, sort of getting out on horseback, and then spending time with the ranch hands from Chihuahua who were not people that I probably would have been able to find by making phone calls to universities and so forth. But then once you're on the ground, one thing leads to another. And that's very much, I have a chapter on the maquiladora economy in the border region in between McAllen, Texas, and Reynosa in Tamaulipas. I knew that I wanted to get sort of inside the world of the American factory managers who live there and who have come to the border for jobs in that industry, and also into the lives of the Mexican factory workers. And I found an organization in McAllen that was the Maquiladora Women's Support Network, which was essentially sort of a coffee klatch of wives of factory managers who had come from other parts of the country, who were kind of building a social network and helping each other sort of navigate living in a place that was unfamiliar. And so I called them up and went to one of their, sort of coffee klatch meetings, and through that met members, and they invited me home, and got to talk to their husbands and sort of understand their perspective, and then through the Chamber of Commerce and the Trade Association, going in to visit the maquiladoras for sort of the official tour of the factory. Then on the Mexican side, the union organizing has been really kind of suppressed in that industry, but there are some binational grassroots groups that do kind of health and safety support and support for workers on organizing about their sort of the conditions of the workplace and their health and so forth. And so called, I think, their U.S. person who put me in touch with their person in Reynosa, and I met her, and she introduced me to folks, and she took me out to this shanty town where there's no telephone, so I wasn't going to be reaching them in advance. But spent a day with a woman who had been a factory worker, had come up from Veracruz, and her husband was a factory worker. She was now home with her little kids, and sort of understanding their life and their experience of these assembly plants at the border. So it's that kind of advanced legwork that prepares the ground, so when you're on the ground, you find the story, and often with not very many days to be sort of kicking around and meeting people and so forth, you have to be pretty directed. In terms of expanding it into a book, there was just really going deeper in my conversations with people, and a lot more background reading and research, so that I really understood the economics of the maquiladoras and how the supply chains for Mexico's assembly plants differ from these sort of Asian tigers in places like Singapore or Taiwan, and sort of looking at that larger picture and looking at issues of the toxic waste and where did that go. And so there's a lot of, really kind of, in some cases, sort of tedious reading into reports and library work that goes into this. And then keeping organized and weeding through it all and figuring out what are the important points. I think one thing that for me was very different in writing a book versus working at a newspaper is that in the newsroom of the newspaper, you have colleagues at the next desk, you have editors who want the story, by 5 o'clock or by next Thursday or whatever it might be. And there's a constant dialogue, people to bounce ideas off of. How do I shape this? I'm a little bit stuck. You go to write a book, they say, okay, we want the manuscript in 18 months. And then they're not always returning your phone calls or your emails, so there's a little bit of a feeling of working in a vacuum. And I had to build my own sort of editorial infrastructure of friends and colleagues and editors. Actually, one person who read it was a journalism professor of mine, fantastic magazine writer, Cynthia Gorney, who is now a colleague of mine at the journalism school at UC Berkeley. And she read a draft of the manuscript and made some comments, and on the ferry crossing, she said, okay, so at some point on this river, you're crossing from the US into Mexico. What we want to know what that is. She said, you need to know, how many pulls of the rope did it take until you crossed the line? I said, I don't know how many pulls of the rope. I can't afford to go back down to Texas and figure this out. So, but this was this little problem that I had to figure out, and it was a little reporting problem. And I found the phone number for the ferry operator, and they were like, oh, we're really too busy, we can't help you with that. And I finally called the port of entry, and I talked to one of the Customs and Border Protection inspectors, and he agreed to go down on his break and count how many pulls it was to cross for the ferry to cross the river. And he said, okay, 78. Okay, so halfway across was 39 pulls, and that was, where you cross across the midline of the river and across the international boundary. So I needed to build the editorial feedback in from somewhere, and so it was from friends and colleagues and other people who could help kind of create the structure that helped me to do my work, because you know, for myself, and I think for a lot of my friends and colleagues who are journalists, this isn't, you know, just sort of a navel-gazing exercise, that we work best with some structure and with some interaction. And so that was one real challenge for me. I want to answer the second part of your question, and then I'll take more questions. So I left the Chronicle a year ago, a little over a year ago. Newspapers are shrinking, and there are, you know, a lot of buyouts and layoffs all across the country. And I didn't really know how things were going to play out outside of the newspaper, because that was, you know, when I came out of journalism school, radio was really my first love, but it seemed like there were more real jobs with steady paychecks and benefits in newspapers at the time, and that's how I gravitated. And I had a great run of, you know, 12, 13 years in newspapers. And then it was time to move on. And the newsroom at the Chronicle was a lot smaller, and their aspirations are a lot more modest. And I think, you know, what I miss is sort of what the paper was. But my friends who are still there are having a hard time and get less opportunity to do the kinds of big stories. I think there's still, I mean, it's a great training ground to become, you know, a journalist. And a newspaper newsroom is really sort of an irreplaceable experience of just, you know, get your assignment, go out, do the reporting, write the story, file the story, get it edited, see it in the paper the next day, and reach a very broad audience. You know, that newspapers are really reaching a mass audience. But for the place where I was in my career and wanting to do larger work, it was time to move on. So I had the book in the works, and then I was doing some teaching at UC Berkeley, and thinking that I was going to be sort of crafting a career as a magazine writer and freelancer, when this position opened up at KQED Public Radio as an editor on the California Report. And I'm actually editing coverage there of state governance and sort of dysfunction in California's governance. But that entails editing radio reporters and stories that are going on the air. It entails editing and producing content that goes on a website. So there is a certain amount of retooling and dusting off my old radio skills, taking some intensive boot camp training on multimedia, and so to the extent that, you know, I'm not an expert on some of those things yet, but I have enough familiarity that I can talk with the interactive producer and say, yes, this lends itself to an interactive timeline. This lends itself to, let's try doing a little series of videos here, or let's just get the radio story up with a text version. Let's do an audio slideshow, whatever it might be, some graphics, some things you can do in newspapers, you can now do on the website of a radio station. So I see this whole convergence happening where the newspaper website wants more visuals, more audio, more video. The radio website wants more text, and they're hiring bloggers, and they're needing to create text versions of their stories, and people who can write fast and write well, because the internet medium wants that, where they just had audio stories. So there is this kind of coming together and a need for all of those skills. And I feel fortunate to be making that transition, but it's not an easy one. I think that you guys are in some ways better positioned because you're hopefully going to come out of here with some familiarity with all of those things. You know, and hopefully some expertise in a particular area as well, but that should stand you in good stead for, you know, being the next generation of figuring out how we do journalism. You?
Just a quick question. Did you pay for everything yourself?
Did I pay for everything myself?
Yeah, sure.
Well, the most of the reporting trips were paid for by the Chronicle, and I traveled on each of them with a photographer, either a staff photographer or a local freelancer. The follow-up stuff came out of my pocket and out of my book advance, which was not huge, but you know, it was enough to do the job. So,
what was your initial reaction when you first started reporting about the dynamism and like the binational lives that you first encountered, and now that your book is all published, like what's your reflection now compared to what your first initial reaction was before?
well, as I say, my very initial reaction was really that, you know, that this was a dividing line and there were these two separate worlds. And then I started to see this recurring thing, and regardless of where I was, that people were living across the border, that people were connecting across the border. But I'm not somebody who's ever lived in a border town. So I was kind of the outsider looking in and trying to tell the story for people who are far away from the border. And I thought, okay, the border is a region, not a line. That's really my theme, my main kind of takeaway point. But is that really true, or did I just kind of concoct that, you know? And so I had to check it a lot against what other people know who do live in the borderlands and who do cover the borderlands. And I guess one thing that's been very satisfying for me is that now the book has been published, I'm getting a lot of feedback from people who know the borderlands, and it does seem to really ring true for them. So that gives me, you know, the confidence that, yeah, I got it right. And that this is a story that people who are far from the borderlands don't necessarily know, and it's an important one to tell. So, but as I go around the country talking about the book, I mean, it's very different. You know, you guys, LA, you're not a border town, but very much influenced with some relationship to the border. But in San Diego, people have a much different sort of base of knowledge than in a place like Boston, right? And so I find that as I talk about it, I have to sort of calibrate the way I present the book, because different people understand it differently or have more or less familiarity.
One quick question. You mentioned this chapter on the maquiladoras. Have you, this is just a question about your impression, but it seems that while there has been this sort of increasing militarization of the border and this effort to sort of drive kind of a physical wedge between the two countries, that there has also been, possibly propelled by NAFTA, a greater economic integration. Do you think that that's an accurate assessment, or can you see any other illustrations of where this is taking place?
Well, there's definitely a greater economic integration, and in some ways that helps to propel the migration pull or push, both.
I mean actually sort of legal on the books economic integration.
Right. Well, there is. I mean, if you look at sort of dollar figures for trade, cross-border trade, it's definitely increased substantially. And part of the sort of the frustration is that that's in a kind of a almost schizophrenic relationship with this border enforcement. And so there are huge costs to that trade as, you know, traffic slows and truck traffic and so forth has to go through this new levels of scrutiny that Homeland Security.
And is there any constituency actively making that point?
I think so, yeah. I think, you know, sort of the chambers of commerce, the business lobby is making that point. And I think there are, as I said, the Obama administration has articulated this idea of like we need to develop a 21st century border where there's screening of cargo before it actually gets to the port of entry, and you can ensure that cargo is secure before it comes across. So they can use, you know, there are ways to do that, but that's kind of the new frontier. But yeah, I think, I mean, for those border communities, they're hugely interdependent. And when it takes an hour and a half or 2 hours to get over the border, or people aren't coming from Mexico to shop in the border cities on the US side, that's a big hit to their, you know, sales tax and just sort of economic revenue there. When people are afraid to go to Mexico because of the violence and the tourism drops, that's a huge hit on the Mexican side. So right, they're at the border, they're very interdependent, and you know, we are Mexico's first largest trading partner. Mexico is our third largest trading partner after Canada and China. So we're very tied economically.
Any other questions? Tom?
Yeah, the idea for the book, was that something that you thought about for a very long time, or did it just kind of evolve as you're with the Chronicle and as you're progressing through your career?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thought came when I got an email from an editor at the University of California Press saying, would you like to turn this into a book? You know, which is a sort of a flattering thing to hear, but then you do have to stop and think like, well, what does this really involve? And, you know, should I get an agent and shop it around, or do I want to go with this press? Or, you know, what would I have to say? Do these stories really merit a book? As a friend and colleague who's written a book said, you know, is this a topic that you really want to spend a couple of years with? Does it have that much, is there that much there, or are you just going to get totally sick of it, or is it not, is it more of an idea for an article? And I had to think through all of that before I really decided, and I had to produce a full-fledged book proposal also for the press, and it had to go through a kind of a vetting process before they accepted it. So there was a few months there of thinking it through and deciding that, yeah, this is something that really fascinates me, and it's really rich, and I want to tell these stories. So, yeah.
I came in a tiny bit, so I hope I've already covered this. But I'm just curious, I know you've talked a little bit about the interdependency between the border spaces. I mean, I know from my family being Mexican American, how the border was very porous in terms of immigration for my grandparents' generation, and then also I covered the border many years ago as a correspondent for Newsweek, and I remember being down at the border with the mayor of Brownsville, and he was with a bunch of dignitaries, and we were coming along the Rio Grande, and some guy was waiting across, and the guy saw it and stopped and started turning back to the direction, and the mayor went, "We better get out of here, we're gonna make that guy late for work." Now he made it as a joke, but that was a sense of like, we are connected and big deal. Mm-hmm. And that, I'm just wondering whether you're seeing that sentiment is completely gone, or has this, are there areas that are still kind of fighting to keep that sense of the porousness being as important to the sense of the place?
It's complex, and I don't want to overgeneralize one way or the other. I don't know who the mayor of Brownsville is now, but it's possible that that's a person who might still feel that way about it. It's certainly true that the University of Texas campus at Brownsville, with the fence building, the federal government was getting ready to build a fence right through the campus, and they were like, wait a second, you can't do that. And so there was a whole negotiation process to get it sort of rerouted around. I think, what can you say? There is, there's so many stories of people who have experienced that kind of porousness or connectedness or whatever it might be. And that's not to say that there aren't people who feel some resentment or some sense of, one of my chapters is dealing with a Minuteman who's not from the borderlands, but he had this very pithy statement where he said, the border is like your skin. It's the place where you end and something else begins, and a nation can't exist without a border for long. And I think there's truth in that, but there's also this reality of the connection. I think you see something like Arizona, where SB 1070 passed and is very popular, but the people in Arizona who live close to the border may not have quite the same sense as people in Phoenix or further away. But certainly in our country, in times of economic recession, I mean, it's very easy, look at the history of immigration, it's easy to point fingers at immigrants and say, you're the problem. What we're not necessarily hearing is that migration has dropped very, very dramatically in the last few years with the economy going down. So I guess, you know, that's still there, but it's not in the same porous way. But the sense of we have a common fate is still a reality at the border.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One thing I will take away is the concept of border lands as opposed to border lines. A lot of everybody spoke on border lands. And if you're interested in reading more, and it's a great read, the book is available outside, and you'd be willing to autograph, sign?
I would. I'd be happy to sign one. Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you.